Okay, welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words about writing, since you folks are doing a lot of it. And I've been impressed, actually, with the improvement I see in people's writings. As you know, Karen and Chris and Patrick have been making comments, and even I've been making comments. And but there are a couple of things I just wanted to remind everyone of. And first is, and by the way, if you don't fall into this category, I apologize for wasting your time talking about this. And I realize I haven't mentioned this yet. And that's how you begin an essay. And this is something I know I struggle with, and I sense other people are struggling with it, even though you might not be aware of it. And you know, I read a lot of essays that have kind of a vague beginning, where the person tells me how much they like the Constitution, or how smart the people were who drafted it, or other kinds of things that, yeah, okay, I'm glad you think that way, but it doesn't really help you start the essay. I'm not saying you should start saying, I hate the Constitution, although that would be quite riveting, because then you'd have to explain why. And I suppose this does raise this kind of truism. It's easier to write a really critical thing about something you hate than, you know, something either you really like, because then you just start gushing, or something you don't really have strong feelings about. So I'm not saying you have to take a position against something in order to be critical, or to write critically. Well, we should actually rewind the tape so I could begin again. This illustrates, though, the point about beginnings. Very difficult to do. And I usually don't know what the beginning will be until I've finished whatever it is I'm writing. And similarly, I don't know what the title is until I'm done, because I'm terrible thinking of titles, terrible about starting something, so I usually just start writing. And then what happens, and by the way, what is idiosyncratic to me in the way I write shouldn't necessarily be the way you write, since, you know, many of you are already doing okay with this. You then know what the essay is about. I will start writing, and depending on how long the thing is I'm working on, 3-4 pages in, I will suddenly get to the point where, you know, the thing I'm writing about is here. I've gotten through all this background stuff. I really love the Constitution. I think Madison was a great guy. He wrote this essay, etc. All of this other kind of background stuff. And then you get to this point where you're actually writing about the thing. And at that point, once you have a draft, you cut out everything up to that point. First might be the first page, 2 pages, 3 pages, however long it's taken you to get warmed up. Now, of course, if you're writing a 5-page essay, and I've just told you cut out the first 3 pages, it means you need to do something else, and we'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, the beginning is difficult. Don't sit down trying to write the perfect beginning, because then you'll never get to the rest of it. Usually, the best thing to do, the best thing I can advise, is once you have written your essay, or a draft of your essay, look at it and figure out what it's about, what your point is. Because, and maybe this would help you if you start off with this simple formula that was taught to me many, many years ago, about how you begin an essay. And this person who explained it to me said, the first paragraph should have 3 sentences. That's all. The first sentence. And you can actually do this kind of a nice formula. We could pick any topic, and you could come up with the 3 sentences that are going to get the reader into what your essay is about, get you into writing it, and solve all of your problems. Okay. Sentence 1, kind of a general introduction to what the paper is about. And don't say, this paper is about, but, I don't know, what did you write about, Mike? Yeah, anyone, yeah. Okay. I think I may have just read it. I can't remember it either, so I'm sorry.
I don't remember. Is there Jefferson administration fulfillment of the...
Okay, good. That's a good question. Was the Jefferson administration a fulfillment of the Revolution? Good question. That would be a good opening sentence. Sentence number 2 would say, I don't know, why it might or might not have been, right? How would it might or might not have been?
I think what I wrote was onto itself. It wasn't. It was a combination of the time
Okay.
the right person.
Okay, actually, that would be the good third sentence of the essay, of the paragraph, because the third sentence tells me what you think, tells the reader what you think, and then that sets up the rest of the essay. Sentence number 2, sure, Jefferson thought it was the fulfillment of the revolution. And then sentence 3, well, was it? Wasn't it? I mean, you take a stand on this. You know, you could be ambivalent and say, well, in some ways it was, some ways it wasn't, then the rest of the essay is how it was, how it wasn't. Or you can say, no, it was a betrayal of the revolution, rest of the essay explains why you think that. Or, yes, it was, absolutely. The statue of Jefferson in his memorial is not big enough, something like that. You know, so sentence number 3 says what you think about this without saying, I think. By the way, you shouldn't use that phrase, or in my opinion, because in the act of writing, you should be expressing what you think. So it's unnecessary to keep telling me that this is what you think, unless, well, we'll get to that in a bit. So that's it. Simple way of beginning an essay. You don't need to recount the whole history of the United States or of democratic thought or anything else. This is your essay. What I want to know is what you think about whatever subject it is. So sentence number 1 tells us what subject it is. Sentence number 2 elaborates a bit on it. Sentence 3, you take a position on this and then get going. And each paragraph should focus on one idea. And, you know, a lot of us have this problem. You're writing along happily, and one thing leads into the next, and you never really step back and say, well, wait a minute, this is kind of a different subject that this is about. This paragraph I started 3 pages ago, and now actually I'm into the Polk administration. Break it up. Figure out where the breaks are, where the different ideas are, and this is something you can do later on, too. You know, writing is a process. Does anyone here sit down and automatically crank out something that's great? Okay, good. I came to the right place. I know I don't. I've just been thinking about this because I've actually been in the process of revising a couple of these books that I've been writing, and you know, I finished them about a year ago and thought, boy, this is pretty good. Now I'm going over them. Realize they're not that good. But I'm not here to tell you about my problems. So, you know, it is a process, and you learn by doing it, by practicing, by writing a lot of stuff that's not any good. And that's the only way you'll figure out how to improve. If everything you write is brilliant, well, you don't need me. And so, you know, go forth with my blessing. But if you want to improve, you just have to keep doing it and try to avoid doing the wrong things. And what are the wrong things? Well, the vague beginnings are one thing, and then there are a couple of things that all of us do, but we should stop doing, and one is use of the passive voice, which is deadly. And sometimes we use it in academia because we think it sounds more learned, but it's a terrible thing to do. Have I talked about passive voice here yet? Or has the passive voice been discussed in this class? That would be how you would put it in the passive voice. You know, things happen. The Constitution was written. Doesn't tell us who wrote it. You know, so you say the Constitution was written, then, well, so what? It sounds like it was inevitable that this would happen. But no, we know that a group of guys wrote the Constitution. You start off saying that in the active voice, then that raises questions. Who were these guys? Why did they write this? What were they trying to do? Simply say the Constitution was written doesn't get you anywhere as far as writing goes. By the way, the passive voice, I usually preach about it as being a bad thing, showing, you know, cluttered thought and so on. But actually, it's a good writing tip. Don't use it because it doesn't lead you anywhere when you're writing. Another thing is wordiness, excess words. Just try to cut them out. In fact, it's one of my hobbies is, you know, seeing how many 100 words I can cut out of something. And, you know, get something concise, precise, something that's going to hit the reader over the head. Excess words, cut them out. And another thing is you want to you're trying to find a way to present something so you make up some imaginary group that thinks something. You know, it has been said, or there are those who believe, or some historians say, and, you know, I don't want to say anything contemporary, But the president does this all the time, makes up these folks who believe something, and he's on the other side. Be specific. Some people think, well, who are these people? I'm really not interested in what lots of historians think. I am interested in what you think. So all you can do is say what it is you think and not try to make up some group somewhere sitting somewhere who thinks differently from you. If you've read something by some specific person and he or she has said something with which you disagree, then say, Gordon Wood says, and I think he's wrong, or he's wrong. You're going to prove that he is wrong, so you don't need to say, I think he is wrong, because either he is or he isn't. I don't know. By the way, I don't think Gordon Wood's wrong about anything. I'm just using this as an example. Yes, Roberto?
Can you give us an example of what's too cliche?
What's too cliche? Well, George Orwell said, never use a phrase that you're used to seeing in print. Okay? I should put on the website Orwell's Politics in the English Language, which is a very good guide to how to write, how not to write, really. And one is, if it's, a phrase you're used to saying, why did you have something in mind, or did Karen say something you wrote was did Karen say something you wrote was a...
But I was trying to,
Well, it depends. Some things are, I don't know, what to you may be this original idea. If I've happened to have seen it before, I may think, oh, that's a cliche. I didn't realize that, gee, you're the only person who's ever thought that. I don't know. Don't use phrases that you're used to seeing in print is one. I don't know. Can anyone think of other examples of cliches? Anyone else have us criticize cliched writing? I haven't read yours, so what was the cliche?
You read mine.
Did I? I did send it back to you, yeah. But, I'm sorry. I apologize. I've been dealing with the cliches I've been writing, so I can't really always remember yours.
You put it in a couple of places, too cliches, and then I'm like, this is not too cliche.
Really?
What is it talking about?
I don't know. Well, I wrote it because I'm not aware that I say things are cliche often. Karen, do you call things cliches a lot?
I'm trying to point out.
Yeah.
24/7.
24/7. Okay, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah. It's another thing to be aware of. There are some phrases that irritate some people, and usually will tell you. And passive voice, I think, irritates all of us. Cliches, what are some others? I don't know. Did you remember what you used? 24/7 is kind of a meaning. Why not say all the time, or perpetually, or something else? It's so avoid that would be a good example. Although that's a phrase coined long after Orwell went to his reward. He would say that's something you're used to seeing all the time, so don't use it. I'm trying to think if there are anyone else have any particular questions you wanted to raise about irritating comments we've made in your margins that... Okay. I don't think we've been shy about pointing out things that... Qualifiers. Yeah, avoid too many qualifiers. Like, what do you have in mind?
You wrote in such a general way that I don't know what...
Okay. Sometimes it's the sentence itself. If I see the sentence, I'd be able to tell you. Maybe that's what I should do next time, is bring in some sentences that people have written that then we all can, have a good laugh about, which is what the graders and I do when we're reading them. I've seen some amazing, actually, I don't do this as a way of humiliating people, but simply of pointing out things that lots of people do and we should stop doing, okay? I know there were a couple, okay, and just be careful with citations, which most people are, using quotes from the sources. And by the way, if you are quoting a letter someone wrote, try to find the letter. That's a good thing. If you can't, then say, this is George Washington, letter to so-and-so, date, quote it in. Because, don't simply find the George Washington quote website and throw out these quotes, because you don't know if these are true or not, who made these quotes up. So try to, I know, I'm not saying you all need to go through Washington's papers now, but you found this somewhere, and whoever it is must have cited it. So it's one way. I had a student a year or two ago who cited all kinds of interesting things from something called right-wing website, which I thought, It actually turned out to be kind of an interesting website, but not really the one you want to be citing in a history class. Nor should you cite left-wing website if there is such a thing. So, unless, of course, you're writing about right-wing or left-wing websites, in which case, yeah, you would have to. But, there are lots of quotes you find that really aren't quotes. They're kind of someone thought, oh, it would be great if Washington had said this. Anyway, try to, so quote whoever quoted him and give credit to whomever found this. Yes?
Do you need to explain also the relevance of the person that received the letter?
No. Unless it's important, okay? But the reason I say this is because over the course of a long life, Washington said all kinds of things, so he's probably dealing with something specific. I mean, he's not simply creating, he's not coming down from on high with all of these quotes that remain constant throughout his life. People's beliefs change, their ideas change, so you need to be conscious of that. And, if Washington is saying, for example, there was a period of about 5 or 6 years when Washington had nothing but good things to say about the French. So you find a quote from Washington then where he's saying great things about the French, and then say, oh yeah, Washington loved the French. Becomes confusing then in the 1790s when the United States is at war with the French, or vice versa. Say, boy, Washington really hated the French because of the XYZ affair. Doesn't really help you if you're trying to figure out what's happening in 1778. So things change, circumstances change, and as historians we have to be conscious of this, that some of these things are timeless truths, but other things do change and evolve. Any other questions on this? I'm not saying this just to put an onerous burden on you, but simply remember this and okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, good. So next week I will try to remember to bring in specific examples, which is something I think I've been telling you. Give specific examples of things, and we'll all be a lot happier. Well, maybe not. Okay, now I was talking a bit last time when we concluded about the Adams administration, and we'll have a number of different issues we'll be covering tonight. But before we really get to those issues, it doesn't make sense unless we know that in 1828, John Quincy Adams lost the election, turned out of office, Andrew Jackson becomes president. And Jackson is different from his predecessors in many ways. And it's worth thinking about Jackson and the kind of political idea he represents, because it is different from what his predecessors were doing. His predecessors, who all differed, by the way, on points of policy, ideology, and so on, shared one thing, and that was in seeing the president as one part of a constitutional system in which laws would emanate from the legislative branch. And it was not the president's job to propose legislation or to tell Congress what it should do, but it was his job to enforce the law, to administer the laws. And this is a philosophical position as well as a political position, and Jackson sees this differently. He sees the president as the only figure in the government who represents all of the people. He's not representing one interest, one faction. He is the one representative of everyone. And in this, Congress has a different role because each member of Congress represents a particular place, a particular group of people. And so a member of Congress, or even Congress as an aggregate body, doesn't really represent all of the people. You may recall that that's exactly what Madison and all had thought Congress would do, and didn't think it was possible for one person to represent everybody. But Jackson sees, yes, one person can represent everybody. Well, I think only if that person is Andrew Jackson. So that's different. So the president is the leader of the nation, and not just part of this balanced government between Congress, etc. And in his first annual message, President Jackson called for eliminating the Electoral College and having a direct election of the president and vice president. Now, one reason he has for doing this, of course, is that in 1824, the Electoral College had not given him a majority, so the choice then fell on the House of Representatives, and Jackson really wants to take that power away from the House of Representatives, both for the practical reason, I suppose, that they had denied him election back in 1824, which he thought was a thwarting of the will of the people, and also, I suppose, as a way of limiting the power of the House of Representatives. Also, from an idea of the role of the House. Actually, what he says is quite interesting in showing us the tenor of his thought, where in the House of Representatives, he said, the will of the people is constantly liable to be misrepresented. One representative may err from ignorance of the wishes of his constituents. Another from a conviction that it is his duty to be governed by his judgment of the fitness of the candidates. So, these members of Congress have their own agenda, and they may be wrong about what the people want. Therefore, the choice of the president should not be in the House of Representatives. And the only figure who is conscious of what a majority of the people want is the president. And so he also calls for limiting the president's term to 4 years or 6 years. And Jackson also established a new precedent here. You will recall that President Adams had kept in place all of Washington's appointees, and Jefferson had made some efforts to appoint different people, but hadn't gone wholesale into trying to change the entire federal bureaucracy. But Jackson does. He thinks that your term of office as a federal bureaucrat should end with the term of the president who appointed you. Limit appointments to 4 years, give each new president the power to appoint his own people. And saying that office is considered a species of property, and government is rather a means of promoting individual interests than as an instrument created solely for the service of the people. Therefore, you turn everybody out when a new president takes office so he can appoint the people that the majority of the Americans wanted in place. He also proposed reorganizing the judiciary. We're going to limit the power of Congress here, its power to appoint and so on. The president will propose legislation. And also, while we're on the subject, I believe, I haven't counted these recently, but I believe that Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, the first 7 presidents, might have altogether vetoed between 7 and a dozen pieces of legislation. They didn't think it was the president's role to veto something unless he thought the Congress had exceeded its constitutional power. That is, the veto was a constitutional tool. It was the president's constitutional check on the legislature. It was not a policy measure. That is, if he were in Congress, would he have voted for this? That wasn't the question. The question was, does Congress have the power to do this? And in a limited number of cases, the first 6 presidents didn't see a great many cases where Congress did exceed its authority. You'll recall Madison vetoed that internal improvements bill, even though he thought internal improvements were a good idea. But he didn't think Congress had the power to do them. He also vetoed a couple of bills to charter or have Congress grant charters to churches in the District of Columbia, because he didn't think the federal government had the power to charter religious institutions. You may recall Madison had very strong ideas on separation of church and state. Not to say he did not, as a private individual, he did contribute to churches, but his role as president was different. Okay, so they don't use the veto a lot. Jackson vetoes that many bills in his first year in office. He uses the veto more than all of his predecessors put together, because yes, this is a policy tool the president has. Why would the Constitution give him this power if he weren't intended to use it? Good question. Jackson also proposed reorganizing the judiciary. And he has good reason for doing this. he wants to create a new group of circuit courts to bring justice to states that don't have federal district courts or circuit courts. And these new circuit court judges, you may think, oh great, Jackson loves judges, so he wants to appoint more. Well, actually, they're going to be now, let's see, how many of these new judges? They're going to be about double the number of judges, but half of them are going to be members of the Supreme Court. And his idea is this: you'll have a Supreme Court with 15 members, a Chief Justice and 14 other judges. But there will only be 8 judges serving at a time on the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, 7 other guys, and 1 year, it'll be Chief Justice Marshall and let's say Team A, they will be sitting in Washington as the Supreme Court. Team B will be out serving as circuit court judges. So they'll get to know what conditions are in the rest of the country. And then the next year they'll switch. So Team B comes to Washington to sit as the Supreme Court. Team A goes off to serve as circuit court judges around the country. Okay? 12 is the number of vetoes Jackson used, by the way. The number just came to me. So what do you make of this system? More Supreme Court judges, but a lot of them will be out learning what the law is in the rest of the country rather than isolating themselves in Washington, where they will be under the sway of Chief Justice Marshall. Any thoughts on this? Excuse me?
It seems like a good idea to have the judges are making decisions for how the cases.
Okay. Seems like a good idea. Have these judges out learning what's happening in the rest of the country. Yeah.
How about the continuity? Because they have cases, the team of judges that started this year on cases are not able to continue next year.
Okay, and they might change their mind too. I mean, Team B may have a different view of things than Team A. So you may lose some continuity here. I think you will lose continuity here, but you may lose time. Sure, I mean, they're not going to be that well prepared when they come. Over the long run, it is going to weaken the Supreme Court quite considerably because they will constantly be fluctuating. And yeah, okay, so I can see this. But Jackson doesn't see a need to have the Supreme Court as a check on the other branches of government. I mean, the president is there to veto things if Congress doesn't do the right thing, okay? Why do you need a court? Why do you need checks on the majority? And for Jackson, yes, it's clear in some systems you do need a check on the executive, but when the executive represents the people, why do you need a check on that? This is really still one of the fundamental questions in a Republican system. Yes, if the king is the executive, yeah, you need checks on him, but if the president is elected by the people, why do you need a check? Yes?
Because if you don't have a check on the majority, it's no longer a republic, now it's a democracy.
Yeah, exactly. It is a democracy now, and this is a transition we see happening. This is why Jackson's party comes to be known as the democracy, the party of the people. And this is the forerunner of the Democratic Party of today. So back in the 1790s, the word democracy was a bad word. Everyone wanted, well, it was a republic was what we had created. Here we see the creation of a democracy, or a democracy embodied by Jackson. Now this brings a point we'll talk about in a bit. Maybe we can talk about it now. Jackson, very popular, okay, and is representative of this time where you see a loosening, a lowering of barriers to voting and other things. States are changing their constitutions to allow all adult white men to vote. The property qualifications that have been instituted in the first constitutions are swept away, and universal white manhood suffrage. Actually, the racial and gender qualifications are added now. You know, the old previous qualification had been property holders, usually not mentioning race or gender, but now they do. So they're opening up the right to vote to more people, but excluding people who frankly weren't voting in great numbers. Now, one thing that happens, just as an aside, Jackson is wildly popular, but there are lots of folks who don't agree with what he's doing for one reason or another. And since what Jackson is doing is wildly popular with the people who count, that is, the voters, how could you raise a question about what he's doing if you, say, disagreed, wanted to run against him, for example? Well, one argument you could make is he has too much power. He is limiting, or he's riding over the power of the other branches of government in order to establish this rule. And so the opposition to Jackson, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, because the main opposition to Jackson comes from people who have profoundly different views among themselves. I talked a little bit last week about John C. Calhoun, and we will get back to him in a little bit. Calhoun really disapproves of much of what Jackson is doing. And Calhoun thinks the federal government is becoming too strong. Daniel Webster also disapproves of what Jackson is doing. He thinks the federal government isn't strong enough. He doesn't like the idea of state power that Calhoun is advancing. Henry Clay also disapproves of what Jackson is doing, and he has this vision for creating an American system with canals and roads and so on, and he doesn't really get along that well with Calhoun, or for that matter with Webster, but all three of them become leaders of the opposition to Jackson. No, so the opposition doesn't say, we oppose Jackson because of his policies, because some of his policies, frankly, one or the other of them might like. Or they might dislike it for different reasons. They do agree Jackson has too much power, so their argument about why Jackson is bad is he has too much power, he's becoming a monarch. King Andrew I doesn't want any check on his power. And because they're trying to argue, by the way, you try running for office saying, I don't like the fact that lots of people are voting and they're not that smart, and government should be in the hands of really smart people like me. See how far you get. In fact, I can give you names of candidates who actually have tried that. You might not remember them. So what do? You say, this guy has too much power. We want to limit the power of the executive. And we're fighting the same fight that those folks did in 1760 against the centralized power of the British government. And those folks were, anyone remember what they called themselves back in the 1760s? The English opposition to centralized power. See, it's been so long, it's been a month or two since we talked about this group. Algernon Sidney and those other characters, John Locke, Bolingbroke. Is actually a pejorative given to them. Whigs. Okay? The Whigs of the 18th century opposed the centralized power of the British crown. So this faction that emerges in opposition to Jackson say, we're also opposed to this centralized power, even though, had they been elected, Clay or Webster would have believed in centralized power. They don't happen to have that tool available. They are the Whigs, and they're opposed to Jackson for all kinds of different reasons. So it becomes a coalition in opposition to the democracy, which represents the great unwashed, the rabble. And Jackson is in many ways their embodiment, this rude backwoodsman. Anyway, I kind of digressed here. So, any questions on this? So, the Whigs and the Democrats, this is actually what historians call the second party system. We had the Federalists and Republicans back in the 1790s. The Federalists pretty much die out or killed off by the War of 1812, and we have this one group, the kind of, well, Democratic Republicans, they can be called, the party of Madison and Monroe. Everyone is on the same side. And then this new party system emerges as a result of these changes, the expansion of the vote, the arrival of Andrew Jackson, and the variety of policies he institutes, the Democratic Party, or the democracy, and the opposition to Jackson comes to be known as the Whigs, even though they don't have a firm ideology. Okay? So the Whigs, Democrats, this will be the major political breakdown between the 1830s and the 1850s, when the Whigs pretty much are killed off by the Compromise of 1850, which we will be talking about in a few weeks. So stay tuned for what happens to the Whigs, for those of you who are interested. Okay. So let's see. Okay. What we should actually do here is talk about this great issue of, I was talking last time about the whole question of state power, federal power, Calhoun's ideas about the future. And Calhoun was quite gloomy. Calhoun didn't like majority rule at all. And he had very interesting constitutional ideas which are worth thinking about. And comes to be, well, we'll tell you more about Calhoun as the time goes on. Now, in 1830, a senator from Connecticut, Senator Foote was his name, introduced a bill in the Senate to sell public lands, which is something the federal government had been doing pretty much consistently since 1789. His proposal led Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina to ask, what is the nature of the Union? And this led to a big debate in the Senate about whether the United States had power over the Western Territory. You see, Calhoun had raised this issue about the Constitution actually being a check on the majority. And if there isn't a check on the majority, you'll have a despotism. You can see why Calhoun is going to be in opposition to Jackson, because Jackson doesn't think there should be a check on the majority. Calhoun thinks, yes, there should. And in this case, the states form the check on the majority. And the Constitution creates a federal government that essentially is a compact among the states. The states created the Constitution. The states can check the power of the federal government. And so Senator Hayne says the federal government cannot sell territory in the West. That territory belongs to the states. And the states have not given the federal government power to govern the Western Territory, sell Western lands. And so the government of the United States is a compact among these sovereign states that had adopted the Constitution. States can interpose their authority against the federal government. Where do they get this idea, by the way, about states interposing their authority against the federal government? Who suggested this? Can states do this, by the way? You're saying no. Yes? Jefferson? Well, you're close. Madison in the Virginia resolutions had said when the federal government does something unconstitutional, the states can interpose their authority. So there's Senator Hayne, Vice President Calhoun are saying, yes, the states can interpose their authority against the federal government. Madison is still alive at this point, and he says, well, that's not what I meant at all. And they say, well, Madison, he's 80 years old now. What does he know? He's kind of losing it. He says he's being misunderstood. Now, you have this argument advanced by Senator Hayne. It's really the argument which had been advanced by Vice President Calhoun, that the Constitution is a compact among the states. The states created the Constitution. The states can or cannot decide, what powers the federal government will have. And, here the immediate issue is the Western lands. The overriding issue still is the tariff, and whether the federal government can impose a tariff which, as Calhoun said, operates differently on different parts of the country. And this, rather innocuous thing, I mean, tariffs aren't that innocuous, but the sale of Western lands is an innocuous thing. It raises this tremendous debate about the nature of the Union. And on one side, you have Senator Hayne, makes a very reasoned argument about the limits to the federal power, and the Constitution is a compact, and the states are the sovereign entities. And on the other side, you have, well, Daniel Webster, I think, gives the most pronounced rejoinder to Haynes. So pronounced, in fact, I tried to put it on our website. In Faneuil Hall, if you go there, there's actually a picture depicting this scene as Webster replies to Haynes. And I apologize for not having it with me, but I suggest we all should go to Faneuil Hall and look at it. Because you have, in the center is Senator Webster standing in the light. And you have, actually, the artist who did this. Has anyone seen this, by the way? And you can't miss it when you go into Faneuil Hall. And unfortunately, the Rangers are there telling you about James Otis and the writs of assistance, and ignore the fact that you have the biggest painting in the city of Boston is hanging behind them with this scene. Well, what's the deal? I'll tell you a little bit about why this painting came into being. This scene so entranced, was it Louis Philippe who becomes King of France in the 1840s? Yes, Louis Philippe. He had been in Boston. He knew about this story. King of France, he commissioned an artist to depict this scene of Webster's reply to Haynes. And the artist, who was one of the great American portrait artists of the 19th century, meticulously painted everyone who was there, and even people who should have been there. So you have in the center Daniel Webster. Then your eye should be drawn up to the gallery. And in the gallery is a portrait of George Washington. So he's looking down on this scene. Then to his immediate right is John Quincy Adams. And next to John Quincy Adams is Mrs. Adams. And there are lots of other Washington socialites. Sitting behind Mrs. Adams this is 1830. There are a couple of notable Frenchmen visiting the United States, Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave Beaumont. They're both up there in the gallery watching this, as well as lots of other folks. And, the artist knew that, Louis Philippe would like having a couple of Frenchmen in the gallery. And then you come down to the floor of the Senate, and you have Webster, as I said, standing in the center. Sitting here, nicely filling the spot that Ignacio is taking, is Henry Clay, looking on approvingly, and the other members of the Senate. Clay is sitting apart from the other senators approvingly. Then in the other spot of light falls on the page, the Senate page. This child representing the future. The future is looking on here as the future is at stake. And then finally in the shadows, there is an eagle overhead, and sitting in the shadow is the presiding officer of the Senate. And who presided over the Senate in 1830? Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, sitting in the shadow. It's like Satan watching this scene unfolding as Webster is replying to Haynes. A powerful thing. And by the way, here in Yankeedom, generations of school children would memorize Webster's reply to Haynes. It's one of the great pieces of political oratory. And I don't have it memorized, unfortunately. That's my project for another day. I was going to assign it to you folks, but has anyone memorized this, by the way? Okay. And Webster, someone once asked Webster, how could you have prepared that reply in 24 hours? Haynes spoke one day, Webster speaks the next. And he says, I have been preparing that for 30 years. As to this point that the Constitution is the creature of the states, Webster asked, is it the creature of the state legislatures, or is it the creature of the people? Haynes's doctrine is that the Constitution is a creature of the states. Not only that, it is the creature of each state. It is a servant with 24 masters. If South Carolina says the tariff is unconstitutional, while Kentucky and Pennsylvania say the tariff is constitutional, how do you resolve this? If there be no power to settle such questions, independent of either of the states, is not the whole Union a rope of sand? Are we not thrown back again precisely on the old Confederation. It is not the state's constitution. It is the people's constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. The people of the United States have declared that the Constitution shall be the supreme law. We must admit this, or we must dispute the people's authority. Webster, by the way, isn't really fond of the people, but he is very much fond of the government they had created. And his conclusion is quite striking as he talks about the union and what it has created. This union created by the people, and that phrase, by the people, for the people, of the people, is one we'll hear again. I have not allowed myself, sir, to look beyond the union, to see what might lie hidden in the dark recess behind. I have not coolly weighed the chances of preserving liberty when the bonds which unite us together shall be broken asunder. I have not accustomed myself to hang over the precipice of disunion, to see whether with my short sight I can fathom the depth of the abyss below. Nor could I regard him as a safe counselor in the affairs of this government, whose thoughts should be mainly bent on considering not how the union may be best preserved, but how tolerable might be the condition of the people when it should be broken up and destroyed. While the union lasts, we have high, exciting, gratifying prospects before us, for us and our children. Beyond that, I seek not to penetrate the veil. God grant that in my day at least, that curtain may not rise. God grant that my vision never may be opened unto what lies behind. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glances rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, now known and honored throughout the earth, still full high and advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in their original luster. Not a stripe erased or polluted, nor a single star obscured. Bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, "What is all this worth?" Nor those other words of delusion and folly, "Liberty first, union afterwards." But everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds as they float over the sea and over the land, in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment, dear to every true American heart: liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. This is the point where you stand up applauding with tears streaming down your face. It's one of these great statements of unity, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. And as I said, generations memorized it. Now we have it on tape, so we can play this over and over again and go visit Faneuil Hall perhaps and recite it, thinking about this particular moment when the Union does seem to hang in the abyss. Bless you. So, any questions on this? So, tariff, still an issue, whether the federal government can, shall we put it, sell land, still an issue, and it will continue to be an issue. Now, in Virginia, of course, Madison also responds to Haynes' argument, saying, okay, I said states could interpose their authority, but the sedition law is different from a tariff law. it's a fundamental right to speak and to publish, not a fundamental right not to pay taxes. And he also said that Virginia called on these several states to act. That is, Virginia said, yeah, the states should interpose their authority, but had insisted all the states should. They wanted other states to join in, and when the other states did not, Virginia didn't say, hey, you know what, the law is void in Virginia anyway. Madison points out that trials for this under the Sedition Act went on in Virginia, even though Virginia was saying this is unconstitutional. And Madison says sovereignty doesn't rest on the states, but on the people in the states. That's the trick here. States, he says, do not retain their sovereignty. The people do. And the people live in states, so that's where they are. And he says any appeal must be to the whole rather than to the parts. And any attempt to allow one part of a state to dominate violates majority rule. And Madison insists, no matter what Calhoun says, majority rule really is the fundamental cause in 1776 and in 1787. Okay, so this is where we are with this whole debate about the limits of federal power. And I should point out, Jackson, while he is expanding the power of the executive, also sees limits to federal power. He believes in states' rights. He opposes the tariff, thinks it's a bad idea, doesn't think the federal government should be in the tariff business. And we'll have more to say about Jackson and his political philosophy in a bit. But at this point, why don't we take a break so we all can calm down from having heard Webster, and when we come back, we'll talk more about Jackson.